Welcome back to the OFFbit. Today we return back to our Core 2 Duo E8400. We'll be pairing this motherboard with the GTX 650 from NVIDIA. In our last feature video we had a GT430. So this time our question is, how much better performance will the GTX 650 play in games? Stick around and find out. Welcome back. Today the GPU we're using is the GTX 650 from Asus. This variant is the GTX 650-DC-1GD5. NVIDIA released the GTX 650 on September the 13th, 2012. GPU clock on this particular variant is 1058 MHz. It's packed with 384 CUDA cores. It's packed with 1 gig of GDDR5 running at an effective clock of 5000 MHz. Card has a pretty black shroud sitting over, looks like a pretty effective heatsink. This card has 1 VGA output, 2 DVI outputs, and 1 HDMI. This card requires one 6-pin Molex power connector on the back, and specifications on the website says it can consume up to 150 watts. When we're running this card, it didn't give us any problems. Fan noise was actually quite low, so all in all, pretty good card. In Australia, you can get these cards pretty cheap. This card I bought was $15 Australian, but they seem to sit around 20 to 30 bucks. Now we've returned back with our Core 2 E8400 setup. This motherboard is the Gigabyte GA-G41MT-S2P. This is an LGA 775 socketed platform motherboard. This motherboard gives you 2 DDR3 DIMM slots. In those DIMM slots we've put 2 sticks of 2 gig DDR1333U. The brand of these sticks is PQI. The CPU we're running today is, of course, the Core 2 Duo E8400. This CPU is clocked at 3 GHz and has 6 meg of level 2 cache. We'll be using our usual hard drives, so that's 2 SSDs and 1 magnetic 1TB drive. Today our version of Windows is Windows 10 build 2004. Now we jump through the formalities, let's jump into some synthetic benchmarks. Just a quick overview on the CPU scores from last video on the E8400 Core 2 Duo. The single core scores in a lot of the tests showed quite strong and sat around most of the other CPUs in the list. In the multi-core scores, that's where we saw the big difference, being a dual core and most of the other chips in the list being a quad core. Showing quite good results for certain games, but games that want more cores, we're going to see big lags. Now if you want a better breakdown of the E8400 CPU, check out our last video on the Core 2 Duo E8400. Now, we're going to move on to the synthetic benchmarks on the GTX 650. In Cinebench R15, our GTX 650 scored us 48.84 frames per second. Absolutely smashing the GT430. For some reason, it beat our GTX 750. But anyway, let's have a look at other benchmarks. In Eugene Heaven, our GTX 650 scored 392 points, which this time the GTX 750 beat it. So interesting score for the Cinebench score. And it's quite notable just how much better it is over the GT430. Moving on to 3D Mark's Firestrike benchmark, our GTX 650 scored 1,929 points. Now in our previous video we did use the GT430 with the E8400, which you can see there, so the GTX 650 is substantially a better video card. We felt that the E8400 was basically getting bottlenecked by the GT430, so we've made another video and we are trying it with the GTX 650. So let's jump out of this and let's get into the fun part. Let's play some games. First game off the bat is Mad Max. This game was suggested by one of our users on our channel. So big thank you and big shout out, now do forgive me if I get this wrong, to Rakib Rumi. Now the game itself actually ran pretty good. We're running this title in 1920 by 1080 with pretty much low settings. The game did suffer from a couple of stutters here and there, and I'd say that's because of the dual core CPU more than anything else. but overall its performance was actually pretty playable. Now, some of the heavier scenes when fighting, you did notice these lags. Anyway, let's have a look at the benchmarks. So Mad Max average frame rate was 40.9 frames per second. We had a minimum frame rate of 17.7 frames per second, and our maximum frame rates hit 61.7 frames per second. The 0.1% lows hit 1.5 frames per second, which would be the bottleneck on that CPU every time it was doing some sort of load, and it just needed more. Now, I do wonder if an overclock would polish that out, but I'm sure there'd be some sort of element of lag left. But, like I said, for most of this game, it played really well. Moving on to an online multiplayer classic, the good old Counter-Strike Source. Look, I would say this game was probably designed to run on dual-core CPUs more than quad-cores. Anyway, in its first iterations of the version, it would have definitely been that. This game pretty much ran creamy smooth on the Core 2 Duo. Now, it did suffer from a couple lag loads here and there, but for most of it, you would have not noticed much more. The game was perfect to play. I don't think you'd have many issues. This is one of the better games that you can play in 2020 and still be able to run into a competitive matches online and give you that 60 frames per second smooth frame rate. Now, we did run this game at 1920 by 1080 and we were running at high presets in the game. The frame rates that we got was actually quite interesting. So our average frame rate was 148.9 frames per second. Minimum frame rates was 51.9 frames per second, and our maximum frame rate almost hit 300. We had 294.1 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows was 2.2 frames per second, and that's those little lag loads that you get. But most of the time, not a problem. This game runs excellent on the Core 2 Duo with this GTX 650. Moving on to Counter-Strike Source's older brother, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or better known as CSGO. Unfortunately, the benchmarking tool for this game does not allow it to run and basically is disabled. So we've had to eyeball this off the Steam frame rate. So the frame rate I'm going to give you for the averages is going to be a bit of a guesstimate. Now, the game ran not too bad. It wasn't perfect. It did suffer from a little slowdowns here and there. But for a game run at 1920 by 1080 with low presets, it ran really good on a Core 2 Duo with the GTX 650. Now, our frame rates, basically we maxed out at like 90-something frames per second. But I think the averages were about 35 to 40 frames per second. Now, it did dip down into the low 20s from here and there. But for the most of it, it sort of sat around 40 to 50 frames per second. So, game played all right. Now, some bigger maps and maybe some bigger battles, it might become a struggle to play on the E8400. However, I think most of the classic standard stock maps would run pretty good on the E8400 paired with the GTX 650. Moving on to Blizzard's Overwatch. Now, amazingly enough, the E8400 seemed to run this game fairly well. Now, the resolution we used for Overwatch was 720p, and we set the details to pretty much low. The gaming experience, I was actually pretty happy playing this game on this system. For most of it, it was pretty smooth. It didn't really break down too much with too many slow, sort of sluggish moments. The frame rate was good enough to aim where I wanted to aim, and really, it was a pretty good experience. Now, it wasn't quite just a 60 frames per second experience, but what we did get, now let's get into the benchmarks. The average frame rate for Overwatch was 48.7 frames per second. Minimum frame rates was 28.7. Maximum frame rate was 69 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows was 21.4 frames per second. Which is a really good achievement for just a dual-core CPU and the GTX 650. This game is playing really well for a Core 2 Duo. This is amazing. And I think you can put it down to the Blizzard boys just writing good games. Staying in the esports category, next game up is Rocket League. We ran Rocket League at 1920 by 1080 with pretty much low settings for the details. This game had a nice, creamy, smooth gameplay to it with pretty high frame rate for what we're looking for, and the game pretty much just sat around there. So this is a big plus. If you want to play a game on a Core 2 Duo that's an esports game, have a look at Rocket League. The frame rates that we got for Rocket League was average frame rate was 84.8 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 52.6. Maximum frame rate hit 119.6 frames per second. And our 0.1% lows hit 28.4 frames per second. So this game did not suffer from any real stutters. So yes, if you're looking for a smooth game to play with your buddies and all you got is a Core 2 Duo E8400 and we're running a GTX 650 or something like that, this is a great game to put on your list to play. Next game on the list is Sea of Thieves from Rare. Now, we did run this at lowest settings, which is pretty much cursed, and our resolution was a 540p resolution. Now, interestingly enough, this game ran smooth and terrible. Now, you're probably wondering what that means. So, for the most of it, the game was running around about 40, 37 something frames per second, somewhere like that. But all of a sudden, it would have a massive load. So the CPU was pretty much sitting around 50, 60%. Then all of a sudden, 100%, boom. Big stutter. You had to sit around. It was almost like a second to 2 seconds at time. So this game could almost be playable. Now, you could give it a go, but be warned, you're going to get some terrible lags, terrible 0.1% lows, so a lot of big stutters. Like we're talking like a second or two, and that could be the difference of you having a good game and a terrible game. And let's jump into the frame rate. So our average frame rate for Sea of Thieves was 37.7 frames per second. Our minimum frame rate was 0.1 frames per second. So the stutters were pulling down the minimum frame rates. That's how bad it was. The maximum frame rate was 77.7, and our 0.1% lows was 0.1 frames per second as well. Now just check out this stutter. So it's holding, it's holding, it's holding, it's holding. Boom, we've hit the ground. So that is the big issue with this game and this CPU. So this game nowhere near perfect, but still impressive that the Core 2 Duo can actually still run this game and it's kind of playable. Next title is a free-to-play game that you can pick up on Steam. This is Path of Exile. So this is RPG hack and slash, as you can see. Now this game ran alright. Now it did suffer some big stutters, some really big stutters. Now we did run this game at 1920 by 1080 with low settings on the details. Now when we first got into it, it did run a lot worse until we pulled those details back. So this game pretty much played a little bit like Sea of Thieves, where it had a load in a big chunk of map or some sort of detail that hadn't been pulled into memory. It would just sit and stutter. So the big problem there is you'll be hacking away at something and a bunch of monsters will come in, it will lag, and then, oh, I'm dead. So because of this fact, this game is kind of unplayable. Now if you're okay if that's happening, then go for it. But I'm pretty sure it's going to give you frustrations. Now, for the benchmarks. Average frame rate for Path of Exile was 37.7 frames per second. Minimum frame rate was 0.2 frames per second. And boom, there's your lags, there's your stutters from those loadings. Our maximum frame rate was 47.2, and our 0.1% lows was 0.2 frames as well. So if you can stand the stutter and the load problems, this game, you'll be happy with it. Other than that, I'd probably avoid and maybe have a look at Diablo 3. And saying that, our next game is Diablo 3. This is the last game we're looking at today, but I left something surprisingly good for last. Now this game played perfectly good. We ran it at 1920 by 1080 on high details. It pretty much almost gave us a 60 frames per second gaming experience. There was no stutters in the game that I'd noticed, and I'm sure in the bigger areas, it will still play quite well. Frame rate for Blizzard's Diablo 3, average frame rates of 55.0 frames per second. Minimum frame rates at 44.5 frames per second. Our maximum frame rate was 65.2 frames per second. Our 0.1% lows was 14.3 frames per second. And that just shows you how well this game ran on the Core 2 Duo E8400 with the GTX 650. So if you've got an E8400, you got yourself a GTX 650. In fact, I think this would even run pretty good on probably the GT430. So you may have to turn some of those settings back. So with an older system, this is definitely a game worth looking at playing if you're into RPGs, hack and slashes. Now just wrapping up today's experiment, the GTX 650 with the E8400 Core 2 Duo. This thing is still a bit of a beast of a processor. Like imagine what this thing was like in the day. Being clocked at 3 gigahertz and 6 mega level 2 cache has definitely helped it hold on to play some games. I mean, you got to cherry pick them, but they can still play some of these games pretty well. Look at Diablo 3. This thing is running brilliant. Probably the only real problem about this processor in games in 2020 was the length of how big those stutters were with loading. Now, we did choose a GTX 650 in this video because we felt like in the last video, the GT430 was the bottlenecking the CPU. And this video proves it. Now, the GTX 650 with the E8400 was quite a solid good pairing. It gave us the raw performance that the E8400 could actually produce. The card gave us no real issues. It was quite good with its sound levels, nothing screaming or whining. Temperatures ran at a pretty good temperature, nothing over the top. So most of the time, the temperature sat around about 50 degrees C. Now, would I recommend this system? Look, I would probably steer clear in 2020 using a Core 2 Duo, but if someone wanted to, the E8400 would be a definite recommendation. Now, as for the GTX 650, now this card is a pretty good card. Now, there is better cards out there on the market, but for the right price, like this card cost me $15. I've seen them between $20 and $30 in Australian market secondhand. That's not bad for this card. Look, I probably wouldn't want to pay any more for that because there's a lot of better cards you can get once you get past that price range. But if you see something around 20, 30 bucks for the GTX 650, it's definitely worth a buy if you're marrying it with a Core 2 Duo. Well, that's all we got today for the OFFbit. I'd like to thank you for watching our video. Now, if you have any questions or any sort of comments you'd like to make, any suggestions of other games for Core 2 Duos, please leave me a line. Now, if you like this video today, please hit that like. And don't forget, if you haven't hit subscribe and you want to see more of this content, please hit that subscribe button. Once again, thanks for watching, and we'll catch you guys next time on the OFFbit.
Diablo himself once walked this place.